And we are live. Hope everyone is having a wonderful Wednesday. Welcome to our webinar on open source software license compliance tools with Heather Meeker. We're just going to give it a minute or two so everyone can make their way in to today's presentation. So thanks for your patience. We will get started in about 60 to 90 seconds or so. Once again, thank you to everyone. As you're making your way into today's webinar, we just want to give folks a chance to get settled. So we'll be starting in approximately a minute or so, and very much appreciate you being here. Just giving it a few more seconds as folks trickle in. Again, hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday. We will get started in about 30 seconds. All right. Yeah, so just giving it a few more seconds for attendees to make their way into today's webinar, but we're about ready to get started. And first and foremost, thank you for being here. Now, let's get started. We're really excited that you've joined us for this webinar on open source license compliance tools with IP attorney extraordinaire Heather Meeker. My name is Andy Drukrev, and I'm on the team here at FOSSA. I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before I go over our agenda and introduce Heather, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping points. First, we'll have time at the end for a Q&A, so we encourage you to post any questions you may have in the questions section of your BrightTalk console. Next, this webinar is being recorded, and it'll be sent out to you after the event. Finally, we at FOSSA will be following up with you after the webinar with a few additional resources, including contact information for Heather, and to see if there's anything we can do to help your organization with license compliance. Now, let's take a look at our agenda for today's webinar. Broadly, our discussion will cover two topics: what to prioritize when evaluating new compliance tools, and strategies to get more value from existing ones. We'll start by looking back at how license compliance tools have evolved over the years and why these origin stories are more relevant to today than one might think. We'll then highlight some of the advanced capabilities of modern tools, then move into specific criteria to help guide your evaluation of new tooling. Finally, we'll discuss ways legal teams can get more value from current compliance tools before wrapping with our Q&A. Now, before I introduce Heather and we get into the meat of the presentation, just wanted to say a quick word for folks who are not familiar with FOSSA. We provide technology that helps organizations manage their use of open source software. Specifically, businesses use our technology to identify and comply with open source software licenses. Now, I am very excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Heather Meeker. I suspect many of you on this webinar might be familiar with Heather, but for those who aren't, she is one of the lawyers who's really shaped modern open source license compliance as we know it. Heather authored the go-to book on the subject, Open Source for Business, and has worked with numerous companies on compliance-related matters, actually including us at FOSSA. She helped us develop some of the rules and policy section of our product. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Heather. And to start, I'm wondering if you might be able to share a bit more of your background, connection with open source, and
Sure. Thank
some
you
of your
very
current
much, Andy,
projects.
and thank you to FOSSA for sponsoring this today. I'm very happy to be talking to all of you out there in virtual land. A little bit about me. I learned to program when I was 8, not very well, by the way, but my father taught me, and this was a long time ago. So of course, I've been involved with software for a great deal of my life, and I find it fascinating and really love it. By the way, my first language that I really learned to program in was Fortran, so that tells you something. Um, I've done a bunch of things in my life, including being a lawyer for quite a while in Silicon Valley, where I have been focused on software transactions of various kinds, and over the years got more and more interested in open source software. And today I still maintain a private practice, but I am a general partner at OSS Capital, which is a venture fund that focuses specifically on early stage investing in commercial open source development, which is about the most specific investment thesis you're probably going to find out there. But we closed our first fund last year, and we are working on our second one. So it's been going great, and we're having a lot of fun helping entrepreneurs build businesses around open source. And as to open source for business, it's in its third edition now. I think I'm probably due for a fourth sometime soon, but I'm trying to stick my head in the sand and avoid that. But it's actually been translated into both Korean and Chinese. So surprisingly, it's had some international appeal. So why don't we get started?
Great. And so that's, your kind of introduction. It's a good segue into our first topic, which is the history of compliance tools and why this history matters when evaluating vendors. And
So, open source compliance tools, if run the clock back 20 years or so, um, there were some commercial tools coming on the market, and I would maybe call this the first generation of tools. And the market leader has always been Black Duck Software. Um, and at the time, there was also a company called Palomito, which has since been acquired and changed its name and so forth. Um, and these tools were developed as audit tools. So let me explain what that means. Um, People realized at that point that open source was what we would call a due diligence issue in transactions. So if you're buying a company or if you're investing in a company, you would want a consultant to come in and look at their code and see what their open source bill of materials was and try to identify any problems with that. There was, by the way, a watershed moment when Cisco bought Linksys, which, if I recall correctly, was in the very early 2000s. And there was a GPL compliance issue with their router. And after that point, the audit services became extremely popular, particularly among serial acquirers, big tech companies in Silicon Valley. But what's important to understand about that is that the tools were used as part of professional services for the most part. So you had people who you hired as human consultants who would use these tools, produce a report, and then provide consulting services to help companies do diligence. What that meant a couple of things about the tools. The first is that audit tools are always engineered to skew to false positives. In other words, that is a design feature for them. When you're doing an audit, you want to find every problem. So false positives you weed out, and then you end up with problems that you actually have to do something about. So that's part of the design of particularly the first generation of tools. The other is that they were designed for use by consultants, and so they really weren't designed for use by companies who were doing development. So as the industry, and by the way, I should say, those two companies were not the only tools there were. There were a whole bunch of homegrown tools, and there were maybe half a dozen other consulting businesses, some of them very good, that were in this space. But over the years, they kind of winnowed out to mostly those two companies. And then both of those companies were acquired, right, by other companies. What happened then was that the open source and security reviews started to merge. And so the tools and services were then offered mostly as a combination service having to do with identifying open source licensing risks and identifying security risks, which always go hand in hand just because of the nature of software development, not because open source is particularly insecure. But that's the way the industry evolved. Now, when you had what I would maybe refer to as a second generation of tools, there was an important change, and that was that the tools were being re-engineered for use on a day-to-day basis by companies who were trying to do open source compliance rather than having an audit. So an audit is, I think of it as a snapshot. You take a specific moment in time and you say, what is the open source bill of materials at this time and what are the problems? Whereas the second generation of tools realized that people wanted to use the tools to do development every day. Now, by that time, the original first generation tools had developed front ends to do that. But the thing was that those front ends were sort of, I guess, they were tacked on in a way. And so those tools weren't developed initially with a view to use day-to-day in compliance. So the second generation of tools was focused more on day-to-day use. They're all useful as audit tools as well. That was one big change. Another big change was that web development had become so much more important, and the original tools were focused mostly on lower level development. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But that's important history to understand about this business and how we ended up with the landscape of tools that we have now.
Got it. So you discussed the origins of license compliance tools, the early generations. What are we looking at with the modern group of license compliance tools from a functionality and
So today, compared to 20 years ago, the way software development is done has changed. It's a much more distributed activity. People are usually not in the same place. They're usually developing asynchronously, and they make extremely heavy use of tools to do development that are like networking tools almost, things like GitHub and Jira and so forth. Jira, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is kind of like a trouble ticketing system where you can open issues and then you can assign the issue to somebody and it routes that issue over to someone to answer. So that's a structured way of dealing with problems or just issues that come up in software development. And this, as opposed to, say, just emailing each other with questions about it, which would be an unstructured way to do it. So first of all, the tools now have integrations with these structured communications approaches. When in the slide it says that they support modern business processes, and that's really kind of what that means. It's much more efficient to resolve problems when you have a structured way to communicate than when you are using unstructured communication. And if you go back to sort of the first generation of tools and what you would get a report. It was usually a spreadsheet of some kind, and you would look at it and maybe make comments on it and email it to someone else and so forth. And maybe you would keep track of problems by adding a column to the spreadsheet. I mean, I still do that every day in audits, but it wasn't a structured way to communicate. So the other thing that modern compliance tools do is, and the old audit tools did this to some extent, but this is now customizable by users. You can set policies specific to use cases. Excuse me. So in open source, there is a big divide between analyzing use cases that don't involve distribution and analyzing use cases that do. So cases that don't involve distribution are like tooling and testing, tools, and backend server software is usually not distributed. And on the other hand, there is software that is in products. And so you're going to have a much greater risk sensitivity about open source for software that's in products than software that is used on the back end, particularly development and testing utilities. So what you can do with modern tools is you can say, here's a code base, and here's my policy for this kind of use case. So don't send me a bunch of red flags on things that are not important for this particular use case. So for example, some of my clients have decided, based on their own risk tolerance, that for SaaS backend software, they're only going to try to identify problems like AGPL and some of the other network copyleft licenses, and they don't even bother to diligence things like GPL and LGPL. And that's a risk decision, but they can actually say that in their policy so they're not constantly being presented with false positives that are going to take a lot of time for them to analyze. Another thing to consider, which is it's kind of transparent here, is that if you do things like an audit, you just take snapshots, you'll be looking at the same problems every single time. The modern tooling, because of the way they work, can allow you to approve something and keep it approved and not have it come up for approval over and over again, which was one of the complaints about the early open source compliance toolings. Other things that you can use the tools for, and this is extremely helpful, is creating license notices for products. So, actually people spend a lot of time creating license text files for products when they're doing binary distribution. We've done another entire webinar about how to do that. This and modern compliance tooling will, if not entirely create that file for you, at least get you most of the way there. So it really saves you a lot of work doing a license notice file by hand, which I have done, and it's really no fun for anybody. As I mentioned, also the modern tooling integrates with developer workflows like Jira or other major development workflows so that they can automatically, through APIs, just connect up, and so that you can automate even further.
Thanks, Heather. And you alluded to this with the discussion of use case, but when we look at evaluating new tools, I'm wondering if you could speak to the connection between what you should prioritize in your search and the nature of your business and how you actually plan to use an open source license.
Sure. First of all, you need to ask yourself, are we really doing audits, or are we doing day-to-day compliance? Most people decide they're doing day-to-day compliance, but even if you decide you're doing day-to-day compliance, you might, at the beginning, want to do an audit to level set your current position. So that's actually kind of a slightly different position. And by the way, when people are getting into a compliance process and if they start from zero, often the first passes they do at compliance are, things like just manual review, or there's a tool called FOSSology, which is a free tool that really, it doesn't operate like most of the commercial tools. It's really just a big text matching program. And so you could do like a first initial pass to kind of get rid of a lot of problems without, it's like a first pass when you're triaging problems. Okay. And then you get into the question of, what does your development actually look like? right? And there's a fair amount of difference between people who are doing, say, custom Linux systems for IoT devices. That's one kind of programming, and people who are building a website, right? Because the languages you're working in are different, and the way you do development is different, and so forth. When you're doing the custom Linux systems, you want a much more granular approach to compliance tooling, because you're much more likely to have what we call cut and paste errors, people cutting and pasting code without copying the license terms. And also, importantly, that kind of coding tends to be in languages like C++, which are traditional compiled binary code, right? Whereas web development is often in source code form and tends to be gluing together a lot of different packages without doing much modification to it. So you need to look at what the tools do and how they work and how quickly they work on different kinds of software. And, what are you really asking the tool to do? Are you looking for cut and paste errors? Are you just looking for sort of a high level look at what packages you're using? And so that's important to understand when you're trying to set out the specs for a tool.
Yeah, and so continuing on with this theme, looks like we have some specific questions that can really help organizations get to the bottom of how they will be
And so
using
these are just some
compliance
things to
tools.
consider so that you understand what features and functionality you need in a compliance tool. So first of all, how many teams do you have? Like it's if you have lots of teams, let me step back for a moment. The most challenging set of facts for this question is that you have lots of teams that work, but they are working on similar kinds of development. So here's why that's so, that's why this pushes the envelope of this question. If I have a team sitting here today, or sitting all over the place today, developing, let's say, a website for me. And then I have another team that operates separately, but what they're doing is an on-premises version or white label version for customers. Okay, there's a lot of overlap between what those teams are doing. And so if you capture information about compliance with one team, you want to be able to capture it for the other team as well. So that actually introduces features that you might need in a product. And that has to do not with the sort of nuts and bolts of looking and finding a bill of materials. That has to do with the layer on top, which I described as, kind of part of the second generation of the tools. That says how you're going to manage that information in your organization and how you're going to structure collaboration among different teams in your organization. So that's also the second question too. Are your teams working together? Or are they working separately? Because if they're working separately, maybe you don't have as pressing needs for the collaborative aspects of doing compliance review. And then there's a question of whether you're distributing product. So as I mentioned, if you're distributing widgets, that have open source built into them, that's actually sort of one classification of sort of risk and likely policy for open source compliance. And then on the other end, if you're doing a website or you're doing SaaS, some things are going to end up getting distributed, the things that execute client side, but most of the software you're using will never be distributed. And so it could have very different compliance rules. So you should understand how many use cases you have. Like most businesses are doing several different things. They might have a website, they might have a SaaS version of a product, they might have an on-premises version of a product, they might have mobile applications, and make sure that the tools can handle different policies for all of those things, because you're going to probably want to have different compliance policies for all of those things. And then a sort of a subset of that is, are you building custom Linux? Because if you are, this is the thing that kind of challenges the tools the most, is tinkering with low-level code. That makes it more difficult to find. It causes the possibility of introducing what we call cut and paste errors, meaning I'm writing something and then I take this little bit of code from somewhere out here and I put it in my what I'm developing, but I don't, it's open source and I don't copy the license terms. So that introduces errors into open source compliance. Also, why are you doing compliance? Well, compliance is a good idea, right? But usually in organizations, there's something motivating it. And often it's you're in discussions for a M&A exit or a financing. And you know that you're going to have to come up with a software bill of materials in order to do proper disclosures in that transaction. Or maybe you're just prepping to do customer deals because you know customers are going to ask for an SBOM for you, from you. Or are you just, generally working on compliance? And this answer might be different for different divisions or, affiliates within your organization. Because if you're thinking of doing a transaction, you're probably looking at more of an audit. And if you're thinking of doing generalized compliance, you're probably looking at a situation where you need these additional collaborative features in order to help people to collaborate on compliance. And then how are you creating notices? Any distributed product requires you to deliver open source license notices. So what's your process for that? Where are they going to be? How can you best use the tools to save you time creating those? And as I mentioned above, customers these days, they want to get SBOM material for you, from you. That's something that more and more customers are asking for these days. I see we have a couple of questions, and there are actually a couple about browser side code, or what I refer to as client side code. One of the questions is, in the case of SaaS deployment, if the OSS components were not distributed, do we really need to clear those to be compliant? Well, you at least need to look at the network copyleft licenses like AGPL, because even with SaaS, you could have source code sharing requirements under a license like AGPL. It's not just AGPL, by the way. There's probably a list of about a dozen of them. It's just that AGPL is by far the most common one. And then we have another related question about browser side code. JavaScript presents a double challenge. Organizations seem to forget that a browser download is a form of distribution. You're absolutely right about that. And available JavaScript is often obscurely licensed. I like that turn of phrase. It sometimes doesn't have any license terms at all, which is a real problem. Yeah, you need to consider HTML, JavaScript, CSS, like the browser, the client side executable code, to be distributed. And then you have to figure out how to do license notices about it, because you do those in a slightly different way from how you would approach them with a distributed product. Someone else asks, when requesting an SBOM from a vendor, is there a standard format that should be requested? Well, that's a very good question. Actually, there is a standard format called SPDX. It's an XML format. And in SPDX, and I think we'll talk about this later, Andy, so, but I think it's probably worth mentioning as the question comes up. You can list it's a very simple format, lists the component, and then there's an identifier for the license, which is a standard identifier. It's like a code. And some customers will actually insist on getting SBOM information through SPDX, But even if they don't, it's a good way to aggregate information because it's a standardized format. It's not terribly difficult to use either. So that's probably the gold standard. Why don't we go on and address a few of these other questions either as we go or maybe at the end.
Sure. So our next slide, Heather, you mentioned when discussing the origin of compliance tools that the original use case was often those audits. When we look now at organizations that are eager to make compliance a continual process, more of a day to day rather than a one time event, what features should people be looking for in compliance?
Um, Mainly, you want to be able to have a tool that automates your business process. And what I mean when I say that is the business process for compliance mainly goes something like this. You set a policy, meaning these licenses are okay for these use cases. If it doesn't fall into that category, then somebody has to approve it. Okay, so that's kind of the basic thing that triggers a review. So that review should, you're probably going to want it to go into a trouble ticketing system. And if you're using Jira for development, say, you might want it to go into that system so that it will remind the right person that they have to do the review. And that person could have a legal designation, a title designation, could be an engineering title designation. So it should route the request to the right person. And you should be able to set up business logic so that when that person approves, the issue gets cleared, or if there's more information, it goes back and asks for more information from the engineering team. So that's really important to have. And most companies who want compliance tools are really focused on this now because it saves them a tremendous amount of time. Um, and what it means is that at every moment you could produce an SBOM. And at every moment, if you had to produce a disclosure, you could produce a disclosure.
So you mentioned earlier in our section on aligning use case with your tool selection that for some organizations, what's particularly important or perhaps not as important would be this collaboration between legal teams and engineering teams. And modern compliance tools do have some built-in capabilities that can make this a lot easier. And one
Um, Yeah, well, first of all, the tools need to be easy to use, and it's better. One of the reasons I keep mentioning Jira is that it's a good example of a tool that engineers are accustomed to using. Um, and so you want to have this. Well, let me step back for a moment. The objective here is not to create work for people. The objective here is to conduct compliance in the way that's most efficient. And usually it's the engineering resources that are the most precious. Like we lawyers who have worked in Silicon Valley are accustomed to that. It's really about saving time for the engineers. And so the tools have to use the interaction methods that the engineers are accustomed to. You don't want the engineers to have to learn an entirely new system in order to do compliance, because if you require them to do that, they probably will not comply, right? So you want to make it as easy as possible for them. Also, you need tools that will work for the environment you're working in. And as I mentioned, there are different kinds of programming environments ranging all the way from kind of the low level programming all the way up to the highest level web programming. And so you want to make sure that it's going to cover all of the development environments that you're talking about. I can't emphasize too much that the more you work within the existing engineering workflows, the more compliance you're going to get from engineers. The worst thing that happens is you set up a compliance program which nobody uses. That's probably worse than having none at all.
All right. Quick note, I'm being told that there are some
Oh,
audio lag issues, so we apologize for that. I think all the audio is audible, but just a bit of a lag. So apologies if that is impacting anyone's viewing. But at this point in the webinar, we want to transition away from how to evaluate new tools to strategies to get more value from existing tools. And this really starts with the way that you configure the rules and policies within your product, within your current license compliance tool. And Heather, this is something that you probably know as well as anybody out there. I know that you advised FOSSA when we built this functionality, and I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit how folks should be looking at configuring these rules and policies when either they implement their new tool or even.
yeah. So it's very helpful if the tool has a kind of an out of the box policy that you can start with, because what the policy will say is, here are 100 licenses, right? For each one of these, you're going to approve or deny within this policy. And the policy usually applies to a particular use case. So let's suppose we're doing a policy for a mobile app, right? So a typical mobile app policy would say no copy left, no GPL or LGPL code. Why? Because it's difficult to comply with those licenses in the mobile app environment. So most companies, it's not impossible, by the way, but I'm just talking about what most companies do. So the modal company will say, for mobile apps, we only want, say, permissive licenses, or licenses like Mozilla and Eclipse are okay because we can comply with those in a mobile app situation. So there'll be a list of tons of licenses. And then for each one of them, it'll say, okay, for mobile app, for the policy called mobile app, here's the ones that are approved. Here's the ones that are not approved and might need other review. If you don't have to build those yourself, that's very helpful. So it's helpful if the tool has a few canned policies that you can start with. Now, you may want to tweak them, and it should have the ability to tweak them, but you want something to start with, and that's going to save you a lot of time or trouble. And by the way, there are lots and lots of licenses. Open source is a long tail, so almost all the code is under like 6 licenses, but there are then hundreds of additional ones. And part of what the tool does is it helps you identify all the outliers, or at least many of the outliers. It's impossible to identify all the outliers, so that the policy will have a really long list, right? But it will help you identify which license something is and apply the policy to it, so that you only have to deal with sort of the exception cases. You also want the tool to give you some meta information, like where the code is, so that you can find it in your development environment once you, if you identify a problem. What the project name is, where the project is on the web, the type of linking that might be applicable for, and this is important particularly for LGPL. So you need flexibility in policies, but it's also useful to have a canned set of policies to start with.
Now, some specific ways that organizations can get more value from existing compliance tools, and Heather, you've covered some of these in delivering license notices and generating SBOMs, which is something that, given the executive order on improving America's cybersecurity that came out last year, that's now requiring organizations to provide SBOMs with the products they create when selling into the federal government. It's only becoming, I think, a more and more important requirement for companies. And wondering if you could speak to just some of these specific ways in a bit more depth that license compliance tools can make
Yeah, well,
business
so the
processes.
industry is slowly, unfortunately, like moving um, towards standardization for compliance, and it's going to get more important as business goes on. What a lot of my clients find is that if they don't have proper compliance processes in place, they can't make sales. And you mentioned the governmental announcement about security and supply chain. Certainly, if you're selling to the government, they're going to be very particular about it. But also, private companies are going to be particular about it too. So, one of the things you can do with tools, or that tools help you do, is comply with something called Open Chain, which is an ISO standard for supply chain compliance for software generally, not just open source. So the tools should provide you with a functionality so that you can actually be compliant. By the way, I would encourage anybody who is selling products, uh, software products, to consider open chain compliance. You can self-certify. It's not terribly difficult to do. And if you look at the requirements in the standard, it's a good guideline to make sure that you have your internal processes in order. And if you have professional tooling, it should provide a lot of what's necessary for open chain compliance certification.
In open chain specification conformance, that is actually something that we at FOSSA can help with as well. So we'll make some information about that available in the attachment section of this webinar after we conclude. But our last slide relates to actually a question that was asked earlier about export formats for SBOMs, and SPDX is one of them. And Heather, wondering if you just might be able to speak to this, what it is, what the use case is here.
Yeah, so I'll just speak very briefly, and then maybe we can get some of these questions answered. I see they're piling up. As I mentioned, SPDX is an XML format, and it has information about software bill of materials. And the kinds of information is what you would be accustomed to seeing in an SBOM: identifying the package, version of the package, where it comes from, what license it's under, and so forth. This is the kind of thing that you usually need, the information you usually need to make a disclosure about open source. So those of you who have gone through any kind of M&A deal or financing, you've probably been asked to do a disclosure of open source. And if the company were using SPDX or a tool that will produce SPDX, it is very easy to produce that information. It's like the flip of a switch. Whereas if you don't have that, then it is an extraordinary amount of work to create a proper software bill of materials. So this will produce, most of the information that you would need in a disclosure. But by the way, those of you who might, not be so familiar with even XML, it's not a complicated format at all. It's basically just a data format. So it's a format that can be easily translated to other formats like spreadsheets and so forth. But this is your basic SPOM information.
Great. So that wraps the presentation part of this webinar. Now, as Heather mentioned, we do have a number of questions. If you have a question and have not asked it yet, please feel free to submit via your BrightTalk console. But to start, let me scroll down. Sorry, one second. Will it be a good decision to choose a proprietary tool or an open source tool? And my assumption is this question relates to a license compliance tool. So is it better to choose a proprietary commercial
Well, it depends on
version or
what
an open source
you're
version?
choosing it for. As I
Um,
mentioned, sometimes when people are starting a compliance process, they use let's see, I think open source tools only include Fossology and the binary analysis tool. There might be others that I'm not aware of. But those are great tools and they're free. But on the other hand, they have limited functionality, and they don't. I don't think Fossology really has much of a layer of business process. I might be wrong about that because it's constantly being developed. Um, But those are things that usually companies use when they are starting the audit process and they want to take a first pass, so that while they're doing a procurement of a commercial tool, or uh, they just want to like find the really obvious problems. That's how they go about it. And Fossology, what it does is it actually looks through the source code and finds like copyright and license notices. So it's not comparing against outside ground truth at all. It's engineered in a completely different way from most of the professional tools. So it doesn't do what the professional tools do, but it does what it does very nicely, and it is a community tool. So that's a nice resource, particularly if you're doing a first pass. Binary analysis tool does analysis of binaries, not source code. So it will say, okay, I found this binary and I know this is an open source binary. This is particularly useful in Linux development. So I would say the commercial tools tend to do things that the open source tools don't do. If you find an open source tool that does all the right things, great, but you're probably not going to find that because the tools are very difficult to and expensive to develop and maintain. And so honestly, like open source applications that are robust in that way are extremely rare, generally, including for compliance processes.
Next question. As now we are using more Docker containers, where the list of open source components are more in number, do we really need to clear all these layers? Or the application layer is more than enough? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I would say always get your containers from a reliable source. Docker containers have been a fantastic technical development, but they were, at least at first, an open source compliance nightmare, because once you've got the container, you can't really tell what's in it. And usually the containers did not have proper license notices. So what I suggest for my clients is either you build the containers on your own so you know what's in them, or else you get them from a source that you are willing to rely on from a commercial point of view. And that source should provide you with all the proper license notices and access to source code. So I'm sure that's not the answer people want to hear, but you can't just ignore compliance because of containers. Containers actually introduce a tremendous amount of information that you have to process. So you either rely on someone else to process that information, or else you do it in a homegrown way.
Typically, with your larger clients, who in the organization owns open source license compliance policy, development, and enforcement?
Well, that's a really good
R&D, legal,
question.
or others?
Um, Open source compliance should really be owned by engineering, because the engineers who are putting together a product are making lots of decisions about their SBOM, right? They're making decisions about security and code quality and maintainability and so forth. And licensing is only one of those elements. So it really needs to be primarily an engineering decision. What the compliance tools do is they tell engineering, you are free to make all these decisions within these guidelines about licensing. So the point of compliance tooling is to free the engineers to do what they want to do on a technical level without causing legal compliance problems. And the tools, a proper policy and tools should be designed so that they only find outliers, and only for outliers are legal brought into the situation. Like, the lawyers should not be controlling this process. They should be your counselors when you have an issue that needs to be looked at. And if you look at it that way, it's usually much more successful. It's important that legal doesn't become a bottleneck to engineering development, because then your compliance process will probably fall apart. I have honestly have had clients who have bought compliance tools and never used them. And that was an expensive mistake. But the reason they didn't use them is because they usually were not very usable. I mean, user friendliness is huge. In case you haven't been able to tell, I've been emphasizing that over and over again. You need to make it easy for the engineers to use the tools. And if you don't, then your compliance process will never get off the ground.
What does distribution exactly
Well,
mean?
so distribution is a right under US copyright law. It's actually, I think, I'm not sure it's unique to US, but it is idiosyncratic to US. And interestingly, this is kind of a legal nerdy question, but it's not actually defined. So the Copyright Act allows copyright owners to exclude others from doing 5 enumerated things: copy, prepare derivative works, distribute, publicly perform, publicly display. And that distribute right is actually not defined. If you want to define it, you have to actually go look in the legislative history of the 1976 Copyright Act. And if you do that, in my opinion, it has 2 elements. One is there's a copy being transferred, and 2, the copy is being transferred to someone else. So what that means is you have to actually deliver something, and it has to be delivered to someone outside your corporate organization. And that's why we say, for instance, that in SaaS, most software isn't distributed, but the stuff that executes client side for the users, if you have customers who are using that, who are not in your organization, they are actually getting copies of that software. So that's distribution. There are many edge cases in modern computing. I won't go into it in detail, but having to do with things like cloud computing and private and public and hybrid clouds and air-gapped systems and kiosks and all sorts of things. So there are some situations in which it's unclear whether software is being distributed. Another question that comes up a lot is when you hire developers to do development for you, are you distributing software to them? By the way, I think it's mostly the answer to that is no, you aren't. But there's actually some controversy about that. So it's a difficult question, but for most use cases, we have, I think, a pretty firm general understanding of whether software is distributed or not.
Thanks to everyone who has submitted a question. We have about 10 minutes left. We will get to as many questions as possible, but apologies in advance if we are not able to get to yours. I think the next question that we will tackle is, do you believe there is an actionable difference between dynamic and static linking?
Well, it's not
with
so much
regard to
whether I
GPL?
believe it, it's whether the Free Software Foundation believes it. And they believe there is no difference. In other words, if you build an executable with GPL code, everything in that executable needs to be GPL. I think that if you go back about 15 or 20 years, you had lawyers saying that dynamically linked code wasn't covered by GPL. And although that's an interesting legal argument, it is not industry practice. So the question is not really about what the law is. I actually believe there's a lot of support for the notion that dynamically linked code isn't included, but that's not what the industry at large has adopted. The industry at large has adopted the rule basically enunciated by Free Software Foundation, which is everything in an executable that has GPL code in it needs to be GPL or GPL compatible, and you can't put proprietary code in there. And by the way, where this really comes to roost most of the time is in the Linux kernel, which is basically a monolithic executable process. And so the rule that comes from that is no proprietary DLLs in kernel space. And by the way, that rule gets broken a little bit, but it's mostly doesn't get broken.
Would you agree that any RFP policy for software should require that the software license text should be required and set to the appropriate open source internal reviewing
I
agent
hope
for
I'm
approval?
interpreting the question correctly, but I'm going to answer the question that I think it is. So I'll do my best. I think that when you acquire licenses or from a vendor or or you hire a consultant to give you software, um, open source compliance information should be part of the acceptance process. In other words, the information about open source compliance and, if necessary, notice files and so forth should be something that gets reviewed and approved before you're obligated to pay for the work or the product. Particularly in consulting, I am a big fan of making that part of an acceptance process, because when you write the contract to begin with, you often don't know what open source is going to be in the product. So if you're doing an RFP, at that stage, you might not know, but there has to be some kind of process for an approval of open source compliance terms before the customer is obligated to pay for what they're getting. I think that's the best way. That's the way it works best.
Would you agree that once you have policies in place, the only open source licenses that should be escalated to legal should be new unapproved terms, new versions of approved terms, or
I'm
deviations
sorry,
from
can
approved terms?
where is that one? Can you read it again?
Yeah, sorry, it's
Oh, here
the
it is. Okay.
like it's the middle of the screen.
Well, I hope I'm answering this question correctly, but you shouldn't have to be approving things over and over again if they're the same use case. The tools need to preserve that information and not make you look at it more than once. Sometimes open source code gets relicensed under other terms, and you have to figure out how to generate review of that. The tool should do that. I mean, there have been some fairly famous changes in licensing terms, but the tool should identify those cases. So the tool should handle that for you. But once you've approved something for a particular use case, a review should only be generated if you have a new use case, or if it's a new piece of software in the product, or where there's a license change.
What are some of the issues that could arise in a custom Linux development scenario?
For custom Linux, you need to be very careful about ensuring that everything that you are putting in kernel space is GPL or GPL compatible. And where that I'm just gonna tell you one, like, modal case that is a problem, just to illustrate how the problems arise. You're writing some custom, like, operating system code, and you're trying to solve a problem. You go and you look on, like, a discussion group, a programming discussion group, and, wow, the name of the most common one is escaping me. Code project. And you look on that, and you go, oh, here's a great piece of code that would work to solve my problem. And you put it in your product. Well, now you have a problem because the code there is actually under a license that's not GPL compatible. So and that's what I referred to as a cut and paste error. Those are the biggest kind of problems you have with Linux development. I mean, in a way, Linux development is easy because everything just has to be GPL, right? Everything in kernel space has to be GPL. Don't expend any time arguing that it should not be, because it's just not worthwhile, right? But you do have to clear everything that's going into your custom development as compatible with GPL.
So we are up against time.
Oh,
Heather, do you
sure,
have
no
time for
problem.
maybe 2 or 3 more? And for I know there will be a number of questions that we aren't able to get to. Again, our apologies, but we will be sending out communication after the webinar And please feel free to follow up our communication with any additional questions you have, and we will do our best to get those answered. This next question is, I think, I love it. It's I think something that we've heard is top of mind for a lot of legal teams at a lot of companies. But Heather, you've noted that engineering should lead the open source compliance function, but open source license non-compliance impact the impact of non-compliance potentially falls on the legal department, i.e., problems in M&A, breach of open source software warranties, etc. Given that dynamic, do you have any suggestions on how to convince engineering of the need for an OSS compliance program beyond the bare minimum of checking for security risks?
That is a good question. So, my answer is about the way dynamics of companies work. And so here's my suggestion. And by the way, I ran into this just the other day. So the engineering team had not followed policy, and they had put a product, a product component in that was what we call dual licensed, meaning it's available under like a GPL and a commercial license. And given the way they used it, they could not comply with AGPL because it was integrated with their proprietary code. So this is when you have dual license products, this is a common issue. Now the good news is that issue can be solved with money, because dual licensing means that the licensor is willing to grant you an alternative license. What you need to say in the organization is, engineering, that goes against your budget. It doesn't go against some kind of general overhead budget, because that was a cost of the way that you did the engineering. And likewise, if you integrate something that's, say, under GPL and it's not dual licensed and you can't comply with GPL, then the re-engineering work to replace that needs to, that's going to go against engineering budget too. So I think if you bring home to the teams that mistakes in compliance are going to come out of their budget and their timeline, that's the way you set up the right incentives. It should not be allowed that you're just not going to solve the problem, because that's irresponsible. It's wrong, and also irresponsible. And the fix needs to come out of the budget of whoever was the gatekeeper for avoiding the problems.
So we have time for two more questions. The first, related to what we discussed earlier about the OpenChain ISO standard, do you think OpenChain is sufficient for real-world compliance? Many consider
Well,
it
I
too
would say
lightweight.
that OpenChain, I'm not really sure that I can weigh in on this. By the way, the people who developed OpenChain just did an absolutely fantastic job. It's one of the most professional, thoughtful projects out there. So I have to give kudos to them, but I would say that it is considered as a kind of a baseline standard, because I know that what they wanted to do was create something that was not difficult to comply with, because if they set the bar too high, people would not comply with it. So there's a lot you can do in addition to OpenChain in order to be, OpenChain would make you compliant, but there's a lot of additional stuff you can do to help your customers and just help open source generally. So those added things, they wouldn't be part of a baseline standard. But what I tell people is, look, if you want to show your customers that you are being compliant, you adopt OpenChain, right? Because that is a signal that you care and you're doing the work. Some customers will demand much more from you than it requires. And they'll demand more from you than the open source licenses require. Those are business issues, right? And they're community issues. But I think OpenChain was intended as, I wouldn't say bare bones, but like a baseline responsible standard. And there's definitely more you can do. There's always more you can do.
our last question, and once again, sincere apologies that we were not able to get to everything that was submitted, but I think it's a good way to conclude the presentation. At the end of the day, what are the real risks of not complying with OSS license terms? I know the answer depends on what license is involved, but it seems quite difficult to locate cases, case law or otherwise, where a company was really
Okay, so
dinged
this
for
is an interesting question
non-compliance.
because I recently published a guest blog with FOSSA about this question in part. I think that open source risk, this question comes up all the time. And the problem is that yeah, there's almost no case law, right? But that's not the problem. It, when when you ask this kind of question, you're looking at open source as a traditional IP risk. And by the way, that's the way it's generally been viewed. And it's not wrong to view it that way. But I think open source needs to be looked at in a way more of an ESG kind of risk, because the kinds of problems that result from open source noncompliance tend not to be lawsuits. There is a fair amount of informal enforcement, and it's almost always done privately, so you wouldn't hear about it. I mean, the lawsuits are absolutely the tip of the iceberg, even more so than in other kinds of IP like patents and so forth. Um, but also there are these additional effects, and the additional effects are loss of reputation, difficulty in recruiting, problems in employee relations with engineers, and just generally not being considered a good citizen in the community. If you don't care about open source compliance and your company employees all know about that, that reputation is going to spread very fast, and it's going to actually prevent some people from wanting to work for you. So how do you even measure that? That's very difficult. And that's similar to an ESG kind of risk, like a privacy problem, or, or doing business in ways that people think are not ethical. Um, it results in a loss of reputation that is very difficult to manage, but often very serious. So I would say, no, there's not much case law at all, but that's part of the problem. There are real risks. They just don't tend to be the kind that can be resolved with money in the way that lawsuits are. And in that makes them, in a way, a little bit trickier to resolve.
Well, thank you, Heather. We've now gone over, but had some fantastic questions. Again, apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but please do feel free to follow up with us with the email you'll be receiving here shortly. And with that, we'll close today's presentation. Can't thank everyone enough for attending. And Heather, we just so appreciate all of your insight and time. This has been a wonderful presentation. So thanks so much to everyone, and have a
Thanks.
great
Bye-bye.
rest of your Wednesday. Bye.